Good morning. Welcome to our webinar today. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that is presented by the Eastern Great Lakes Association of Contingency Professionals and also by the Rochester Chamber of Commerce. Today we're going to be discussing what should every leader know about crisis intuition. We'd like to have you as our friend on Facebook, Firestorm Solutions. You can follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. We have a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. We'd also like to remind you that Firestorm transforms crisis into value. We are America's Crisis Coach. We follow a predict, plan, perform module. Firestorm's expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Keep in mind that our presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. This work product should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, advice given and comments made should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. The Eastern Great Lakes Association of Contingency Professionals planners is represented by Dr. Michael Redmond. Dr. Redmond is on an assignment elsewhere today. She's not able to join us. They are having a convention coming up. Please go to their group and follow and check with their website, see what you can do for them. They're a great group to associate with, and they do really good seminars and meetings and instructional plans. And that's more. You can go to firestorm.com. You can watch previous webinars in this series, or you can register for future webinars. Today, our presenter is Guy Higgins. Guy is a principal of Firestorm. He's located in the Colorado area. He's a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, and he spent time as a flyboy trying to avoid crashing his airplane. And we invite him to be our presenter today. Guy, over to you, please.
Okay, thanks, Bill. And as Bill said, I spent time in the Navy and accumulated 4,300 flight hours, and we do like to fly in the middle of the air because the edges of the air contain dangerous things like rocks, mountains, and trees. So I want to start today by saying thanks to everybody who is attending the webinar. And what I want to do right now is tell you a little story because I like to tell stories. And this one I think is germane, and we'll come back to it throughout the webinar. In 1914, the summer of 1914, Ernest Shackleton assembled an expedition in England and collected a group of men and sailed south with the intention of walking across the Antarctic continent. He sailed down to the Falkland Islands to finish preparation, and when he got to the Falklands, New South Georgia, he was told that the preceding winter, remember he's in the southern hemisphere now, so summer is approaching him, he's in late spring, he's told that the past winter was extremely bad and that the spring has been much, much colder than normal, and that the Antarctic ice flows and sea ice is much denser and much heavier, and that the locals don't remember any summer, approaching summer, that is as, looking to be as cold and miserable as this one. And cold and miserable is the best that it gets in the Antarctic Ocean. Shackleton listened to this, recognized that in August, he's now in August of 1914, that in August of 1914, the world, Europe, is busy doing something else, and that is creating World War I and doing, as one historian said, committing suicide as a continent. Nonetheless, Shackleton continued to pursue his goal and sailed from New South Georgia down into the Antarctic Ocean and found himself trapped in the sea ice, which froze around his ship. And this photograph is a photograph of the expedition standing on the ice at the bow of their ship. Shackleton and his crew, his expedition, spent about 6 or 7 weeks entertaining themselves and waiting for the warming of summer to break up the sea ice. to no avail. The sea ice got thicker and harder and froze more and more and eventually crushed the ship, and they were forced to abandon the ship and take one of their longboats, load it with all of the emergency supplies that they could, and physically dragged it across the sea ice to Elephant Island, where Shackleton left the majority of the expedition, taking a couple of his men with him in the longboat, where they rigged a mast, a sail, and a partial cover over the longboat, and they sailed and navigated 1,200 plus nautical miles back to New South Georgia, where they landed on the south shore of the island, crossed the mountain chain in the middle of the island, and organized a rescue operation where they went back and collected all of the men that they had left on Elephant Island. They lost no one, and no one suffered from any undue health or injury trauma. What he did was absolutely astounding, because he's in a basically open longboat sailing across this in absolutely horrible weather. The only navigational aids he has is celestial, and celestial works only if you can see the sun, moon, and stars. And in that weather, that's a fairly rare occurrence. There's a lot of overcast there. 1,200 miles sailing in an open longboat is absolutely astounding. It is akin to William Bligh's sailing 1,000-mile plus after the mutiny on the Bounty, an absolutely remarkable feat of seamanship and marine navigation. So the question, though, was that an example of good leadership? Well, once they got stuck in the ice, Shackleton demonstrated superhuman leadership. The problem was that leadership isn't something that starts when you have a problem. Leadership is something that starts before you have a problem. And Shackleton, while he organized the expedition, he is mono-focused on the goal of the expedition, led him into extremis. And a good leader is not going to let that happen. He will have plans, he or she will have plans ahead of time for what happens if. And those are some of the cases that we're going to talk about today during this webinar. I'm going to look at 3 pairs of case studies. Each one will be one of those famous, 10th grade English teacher compare and contrast type of things that we all hated so much. In each pair of case studies, I'll look at what kind of pressure existed. Was the decision-making easy or difficult? Were there any ethical challenges, and why? And were they able to manage the consequences? The case studies I'm going to look at are going to be the Malaysia Air loss of Flight 370 that you recall disappeared, and we're still unsure where it will eventually crash. Air Asia, which had an accident shortly thereafter. We're going to look at British Petroleum and Chevron incidents that were in the news. And then we're going to look at a Louisiana State University bomb threat evacuation and an armed intruder incident at Chardon High School in Cleveland, Ohio. So we'll start by looking at Malaysia Air Flight 370. So just as a little bit of a refresher, because I'm sure not everybody is an aviation guy like me and remembers these things. Flight 370 took off out of Kuala Lumpur, headed to East Asia. 777, lots of people on board, a couple hundred. They flew for about 20 minutes under civilian air traffic control, radar contact, and then they disappeared off civilian air traffic control. Malaysia Air is a state-sponsored airline, so the government of Malaysia got on the line and announced that they had lost radar contact, and not knowing anything, began to put out thoughts about what might be happening and talking about those kinds of things. And this is really bad, because when something happens, you're either going to know everything immediately, or you're not going to know much at all, and much of what you do know will be wrong. And so at that point, they started operating off questionable information, and then after announcing that they'd lost radar contact, they announced that they had not lost radar contact, but only civilian radar contact, and that military radar contact was maintained for another 20 minutes when they lost all contact with the airplane, which later turned out to be false, because there was still telemetry data being relayed from the airplane itself through satellite links back to the airline headquarters and to the manufacturer. So that telemetry data was still available and allowed the airplane to be tracked, although not in real time. And that's how the track back over the Indonesian peninsula and back, or Malaysian peninsula and back into the Indian Ocean was eventually determined. The government issued press releases and press conferences. They appear not to have had a plan to deal with this and to have responded in an ad hoc manner. What kind of pressure were they under? There were over 200 people whose lives are in jeopardy. They knew that. Tremendous amount of pressure. And as a result, because they appear not to have thought about this ahead of time and to have had a plan, their decision making was very difficult. They were facing ethical challenges. Do they take a pessimistic approach? Do they take an optimistic approach? If they take an optimistic approach, what do they do as opposed to making a more pessimistic approach? And how are they going to manage consequences? Well, they took an optimistic approach, and that resulted in them having to continually decide whether or not they were going to notify emergency contacts and next of kin about the potential loss of these people. They had to make those decisions in real time. They weren't prepared to do it in an organized manner, and therefore there were some severely adverse consequences for Malaysian Air. And in fact, even now today, Malaysian Air is still suffering some lingering effects from that. In contrast, AirAsia, which had a fatal crash shortly after takeoff of one of their airlines, they knew what happened. They knew for a fact the airplane crashed. They did not know if everyone on board was killed. They did not know why the airplane crashed, but they immediately began contacting the people who were in the departure terminal to gather them together and to begin to communicate with them. They accessed the manifest and began to call emergency points of contact around Asia, both at the departure and destination sites. Tell the people what they knew. There's been a crash. We're certain there are some fatalities. We don't know how many. We don't know why. We will do our best to find out. We're going to open an operations center at the departure airport. Everybody who's not at the departure airport, we will pay for your transportation to the departure airport so that you can be there where we are operating, get immediate communication. We will pay for your lodging and your food while you're there, and we'll talk to you. The CEO himself went down to the departure airport, spoke with all of the people who were gathered there as a group, and then went among them and spoke to the people individually, telling them what he knew. They continually refreshed the communication, and they did their best to be transparent. It appears that AirAsia had thought about what they were going to do, and they had a plan in place, and they had done some practice on it, because that went very smoothly for them, and there were very few lingering ill effects for AirAsia on that. Let's now look at BP and Chevron. You'll probably recall British Petroleum had suffered the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe several years ago in the Gulf of Mexico. So once again, really quickly, what happened was they had a blowout on a well being drilled in the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. That blowout resulted in an explosion and fire on the drilling platform, and 11 men were killed. BP immediately responded to that situation, and they came out with a statement that was optimistic from the get-go. They didn't admit to not knowing. They came out and said that the situation was in hand and that they'd be able to cap the well very shortly, and that the environmental impact would be minimal because the leakage was very low level leakage of this. It turned out that there were tens of thousands of barrels per hour being leaked into the Gulf of Mexico. The 11 men who were killed was not addressed in any kind of detail in the public releases. BP, you may recall that the CEO in a broadcast live television interview said that he was as concerned with this as anyone because all he wanted to do was get his life back. Well, that's probably the thing that if you look up stupid statements in Wikipedia, that's probably the one that's there. Just a terrible, terrible thing for him to have said, and that kind of thing indicates that British Petroleum had not thought about what to say and who should say it, and what the venues and the media channel should be to do that. Were they under pressure making decisions? Absolutely. It was 11 people who were dead, many more who were injured. Tremendous ethical decisions. How do you deal with that? What's the focus? What should the focus be? How are you going to respond to that? Making ad hoc decisions at this point is the worst possible thing that you can do, and the consequences, even today, you're seeing British Petroleum commercials on television talking about how they are taking environment seriously. Well, that's really good now, but they should have taken it seriously 5 or 6 years ago. Chevron, on the other hand, had a incident in a refinery in Southern California, and that's the photograph that you see there in the lower right. They had an explosion and a fire. They got on Twitter immediately and announced what had happened. We've had an explosion, there's a fire at our Long Beach refinery. We'll keep people posted. Literally a couple of minutes later, they updated that, and they continued to update via Twitter. They also, like BP, they also issued press releases. They also had press conferences. They also talked to the first responders who were there. They supported the first responders in talking to the media about that, but they continued to tweet, and they made commitments. We know what's going on now. We know that there have been a couple injuries, but there are no fatalities. We know that the fire is isolated to this part of the refinery. We know that this is going on. We know that it'll be contained within the next X number of hours. We know that there's environmental damage. You can see the smoke that's billowing up over the refinery there. We will make it good. And they commit, and then in the following days, they continue to follow up on that. So were they under pressure? They were under a lot less pressure than BP was. Their decision-making was much easier because they sat around the table with a bunch of cups of coffee talking about what the decisions would have to be. What challenges are we going to face, and what decisions are we going to make? Once you've got that done, it's easy to do. It's easy to follow the plan. It's tough to make up the plan when you're under pressure. Were they facing ethical challenges? Certainly. It would have been easy for them to have painted a rosy picture on this, but they resisted that temptation, owned up to what was going on, and there were virtually no long-term consequences to Chevron from this event. So if we look now at the case studies in the educational domain, several years ago there were a series of bomb threats to universities across the United States, and one of those went to Louisiana State University. Louisiana State University, it's obvious, had a plan for a bomb threat, which is probably a good thing to do. That's tongue-in-cheek. They immediately tweeted, good idea. They immediately tweeted the tweet that you see there. Bomb threat's been reported on the LSU campus. Please evacuate as calmly and quickly as possible. Okay, to that point, that's good. However, I want to make the point that the LSU campus is 360 couple acres, and no matter how you configure those 360 couple acres, no point on the campus is more than 400 or 500 yards away from off campus. And there are almost no people on the LSU campus who can't walk 400 or 500 yards. If people had walked off the campus, then those relatively small number of people who need to be driven or need to drive off the campus could have done so easily. However, being the United States, we did not walk off the LSU campus. We immediately jumped into our cars and joined the world's longest linear parking lot. It took hours for that traffic jam to clear, and while it was there, it impeded access by first responders, by the fire, the police, explosive disposal, EMTs. People had difficulty not only getting off the campus, they had difficulty getting on the campus, and this resulted in an increased risk and increased exposure. So while LSU apparently had a plan, they hadn't thought through and trained and practiced on that plan to see where the problems might arise. And had they done that, it's likely they would have said, well, jeepers, you know, we have about 20,000 cars parked on this campus. If everybody tries to leave at once, it's going to be a real mess. I mean, that doesn't take any rocket science kind of thought to come to that conclusion. So while LSU had a plan, it's not obvious that they had trained on that plan or that they had practiced that plan, and those are important, and we'll return to that. So Chardon High School. Chardon High School had a plan for an armed intruder, and they had exercised that plan. About 2 days after they exercised that plan, they had an armed intruder event. And Chardon High School immediately activated their plan, called 911, reported the situation. A student had gone into the cafeteria and shot a couple of other students. Faculty who were in the cafeteria immediately acted, controlled the situation, disarmed the student, and the event was over within literally a couple of minutes. And that's important. The average active shooter event lasts about 4 minutes. The average first responder time is about 7 minutes. So the average event lasts less time than the time it takes first responders to respond. That's not a slam at first responders. Responding in 7 minutes is a phenomenally quick response time. But we're all our own first responders, and so having a plan and practicing it is really important. And Chardon High School had done that. Now, they put the school under lockdown at the same time they called 911, and the faculty in the cafeteria were taking care of the situation there. They went into lockdown, and we now have a couple of buildings full of high school students, all of whom have smartphones, and all of whom have immediately become their own broadcast corporation. They're out there tweeting all sorts of stuff, none of which they know, all of which is speculation, and Chardon hadn't thought about what would happen when that happened. So MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, CBS, everybody in the world, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, is busy tweeting with these kids and publishing stuff in real time on the internet that is just rumor and speculation from a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds. So that part had not been thought about. And the thing that Chardon had to deal with was the fallout of those things and trying to contact parents and provide parents and guardians with actual fact rather than with what's getting put out on the internet at that point. And since it's the internet, everybody knows it must be right. So with those in mind, what are we going to talk about in leadership? As I said with Ernest Shackleton, leadership starts not when you have a crisis, but before you have a crisis. It's the pre-action phase that is important for leadership to start the process. You need to have a strategy. What's going to be our approach to respond to an event? What's going to be our approach to manage that event and recover from it? And what things do we need to consider? What legal considerations are there? Are you legally bound to report things to people? Are you subject to certain regulations that require reporting? What are the ethical challenges? And I'm sure I'm going to take a little diversion here. I don't know. I think most people probably have heard of the Equifax hack and the fact that 143 million Americans have had their private information exposed through the Equifax hack, and that Equifax has taken a big hit. Well, it turns out that Equifax knew about this hack several weeks ago. And between the time that Equifax knew about the hack and the time that they announced it publicly, their chief financial officer and one of their other C-suite executives sold significant amount of stock, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Equifax stock. Whoa, man, I mean, that just drips with a bad ethical decision. That's something that needs to be considered before, not after an event occurs. Because if you start thinking about things after an event occurs, you're going to miss things. You're going to miss important things. You're going to miss things that can really damage your brand and reputation. Once the strategy is established, let's put those plans in place. And the plans need to say what needs to be done, who needs to do that, and how are they going to do it. You're in an emergency or a crisis. Now is not the time to rely on somebody's memory about how to do things. Professional athletes practice their game plan against an opposing force because they want to go out there and exercise what it was they said they were going to do. They want the how as well as the what, and they want to be able to do that all along. So they put together the game plan, they train to that game plan, and they exercise that game plan. And they do that for every one of their opponents. It's important to do that because we want to be able to overcome the barriers to having an effective preparation. The things that can be those barriers: attitude, disaster denial. That won't happen to us. Well, the question I always ask organizations that tell me that won't happen to us is, when do you expect to go out of business? Because if you expect to stay in business for the indefinite future, the probabilities of even low probability events start to go up cumulatively. You know, if the probability for something is 1 in 10 million, but you plan to stay in business for the next 100 years, it stops being 1 in 10 million. And it gets to be something that you're going to want to take advantage of. And while I was on active duty in the Navy, I worked with the McDonnell Douglas guys out in St. Louis, and I was working with them when they had a 100-year flood. And then a year later, they had their second 100-year flood. So just because something is 1 in 10 million or a 100-year event or a 1,000-year event doesn't mean it won't happen again next year or next month or next week. So disaster denial is something we all have to overcome. We have to look at that rationally. Another attitude is what we have is good enough. And it may be good enough, but it may not be. And if you haven't trained on it, if you haven't exercised it, then you don't know if it's good enough. You need to get past that, and you need to think through that. Now, my business partner, Jennifer Friedman, and I have actually heard somebody say, we're good. We're good enough. We don't need plans. We're problem solvers. We have a decades-long history of solving difficult problems and doing that as they crop up. Okay, that's fine. Don't expect the future to look just like the past. The future has got ugly things buried in it, and it's not a good idea to bet your company on the future being just like the past. You do need plans. The problem, of course, is that there are conflicting priorities. It's difficult to remember that your goal was to drain the swamp when you're up to your ears in alligators. And you have those conflicting priorities. You need to deal with the alligators, but you need to keep your eye on draining that swamp too, reducing your overall risk, and then maybe some of those alligators will go away. Now, why are there conflicting priorities? They're conflicting priorities because nobody has any spare resources. I've worked with a lot of companies. I've been in companies. Nobody has a lower left-hand desk drawer full of unused, undemanded resources. Okay, every resource you have is committed, every one of them. Culture of a company or an organization can be a problem. That gets back to the attitudes. Okay, you can have culture be a benefit to you. You can have culture be a barrier to you, and you need to look at what your culture is and take advantage of the good parts and think about how it is you're going to morph the bad parts into being good parts. And part of that is having ownership. And we'll talk about that on the next page. But ownership is where everyone in the company talks about our plan, not the company's plan or the plan that Firestorm developed for us or the plan that Joe Bag of Donuts put together. This is our plan, and having ownership of the plan means people will execute the plan because it's my plan. Legal opinion is mostly a good thing, but it can come back and not be a good thing. We've seen situations where legal counsel said, I will not approve messages before we actually have the event. So during the event, time of crisis, we want to approve all those messages. Well, that puts you into the BP, putting your message out via press release, as opposed to being Chevron and putting your message out via Twitter. That can be a real problem. We've also heard legal opinions say, jeepers, you know, if we have a plan for that, then we're putting ourselves at risk of not executing exactly and perfectly to that plan, and therefore being liable to a lawsuit downstream because our actual behavior was not in accordance with our plan. That's not a good idea, okay? I mean, that's just not a good idea. I understand what legal is saying, what counsel is saying. However, you can get sued for just as well for not having a plan as you can for not following it. In fact, I'll assert that you're more likely to get sued for not having a plan than for not following the plan perfectly. So to overcome those barriers, we need to have participative leadership. And by that, I mean the organizational corporate leadership needs to reach out and bring in the people who are going to execute the plan. Not just the people who are going to put the plan together, but who are going to execute it. And bring them in and collect their ideas and allow them to take this and build it themselves. They're the ones who are going to have the best idea of how to go about doing this. I worked with a small company in New Jersey who did a superb job of reaching out to the people who were going to be on their emergency teams, their crisis teams, and they're the ones that put together the details of the how to respond to these things as well as a lot of the what to. Communicate with the entire company. Here's what we're doing. Be transparent about it. Here's why we're doing it. We're doing it because it's important for us to not just be excellent at business as usual, but we want to be excellent at business as unusual, because the better we respond to emergencies and crises, the more likely we are to survive those. We'll continue to make money, satisfy ownership, be good guys, be happy, and keep your jobs in place so that you can be happy and make money. That kind of transparency and communication is important, and there needs to be follow through. Once the plans are in place, there needs to be training, there needs to be exercise, and it can't be a one and done event. We have to have exercises every year. We have to look at what's changed, and therefore what do we have to change in our plans and our exercises. And it's those things that build ownership, the participative leadership, the transparency, the communication, the follow-through, the visible commitment of leadership builds ownership throughout the company. And that's really important. People will execute my plan better than they will your plan. That's the, in quotes, mine and yours. What does that do? That builds muscle memory. Just like a professional athlete builds that muscle memory, training and execution builds that kind of muscle memory, and it's that experience that leads to intuition. Intuition is not something magical that comes about because we happen to be in a certain position or we were born with an intuition. Intuition is simply cumulative experience. It's cumulative experience applied at a subcognitive level. And it's really important. Having that muscle memory that builds that intuition through experience allows us to have the confidence that we know how to deal with this and we have the plan. And that results in better performance. So when I was in the Navy, I worked for a 3-star admiral, Vice Admiral Paul McCarthy. Paul, a really good guy. He had been the commanding officer as a Navy captain, the commanding officer of a carrier in the Western Pacific. He was the CO of USS Midway, which is now a museum in San Diego. And Paul said, he said, the first year I was out there as the skipper of the Midway, we had a war game and it was awful. He says, we just ran around bumping into ourselves, and there's just absolutely no doubt in the world that we would have all died had it been a real situation. The next year, he was still CO of the carrier, and they had another war game, and they did better. Then Paul got promoted and got his first star and was given command of the carrier group in the Western Pacific, which is the Midway and a couple of other ships. And they had another war game. Well, now he's got 2 war games. He and his staff have got 2 war games under their belt, and they're now doing a 3rd one, and they were even better. And then Paul was picked for his 2nd star and given command of a task force. And they had their annual war game, and they did even better. The next year, while he still has the task force, they did another war game, and they were even better. And then he got his 3rd star and was given command of the U.S. 7th Fleet. And the war game they had while he was the fleet commander was really, really well done, because they had years of experience doing this stuff, and they built up a staff and passed down organizational knowledge that allowed them to continue to improve their performance in spite of the fact that over that 5 or 6 year period, there were almost none of the people other than Paul himself who had participated in that first war game Paul talked to me about. So even though you lose people over time, you're building organizational knowledge, and you're building that knowledge value stream in business as unusual, and that will result in better performance. So there's a real flow to this. If you create the strategy, the leadership creates the strategy, empowers people, builds ownership, builds the plans with people who are going to execute them, trains on those plans, exercises those plans, and then you build that kind of value stream, that knowledge value stream that results in improved performance. And it's important to recognize, too, that as you go through this, it's almost certain that you will find opportunities to improve your processes. Your daily processes are things that you will look at as you look at recovery from a crisis or an emergency. You'll look at those daily processes and you'll say, well, here's what we would need to do to recover. it's likely that you will find ways to make your daily processes better. And in fact, the Baldrige Excellence Criteria includes emergency and crisis response as one of the factors that contributes to overall business excellence. And that recognition is really important. There's a feedback loop. So the investment of resources and the leadership's commitment to developing strategies and plans for performance during crisis and emergencies is just as important and has feedback into leadership during business as usual. So leadership during pre-action, we want to create that team. We want to build the plan. We want to develop the experience so that during a crisis, muscle memory takes over, and unlike Ernest Shackleton, we don't have to drag the longboat across 100 miles of sea ice and then sail over 1,200 nautical miles through some of the worst weather in the world in an open longboat to climb over a bunch of mountains in order to organize a rescue operation. We don't need to have superhuman leadership in crisis if we have good leadership before the crisis. And that's really important to take that into account and make sure that we execute that kind of leadership. So there will be a brief that you can access on the Firestorm website and download that brief that will recap what we've talked about this morning and allow you to put that in your file and look at it while you're building, updating your plans for preparedness in the event of business as unusual. Are there any questions? And Bill, for whatever reason, I can't read the questions right now.
No, there are no questions, Guy.
Well, either I baffled them with BS or I stunned them with brilliance. So, William, over to you. Bill, are you still there?
I am. Yeah. Yep.
So, since Michael is not here, I don't know that we have anything to say, and I would like to thank everybody for their forbearance this morning, and I hope that the webinar was valuable to you.
Good. Thank you, Guy. Appreciate your comments and insights. And we'll talk to everyone on this webinar next month. Thank you.